Look, I know everyone has their big AAA games that they look forward to on a yearly basis. But for me, I'm usually looking at a smaller game from a developer that I've fallen in love with from a previous game that are on top of my list. It's a high bar for this game too, as today's review is the next JRPG from the developer of Munana, whose game Virgo vs. the Zodiac is currently on my Indie Game Hall of Fame. Keylocker is a grid and turn-based RPG set in a dystopian cyberpunk world that releases today, September 18th, 2024, for the price of $19.99. It releases on the PC, Nintendo Switch, PlayStation 5, and the Xbox Series X and S. On screen, you can see the number of hours that I played, getting reasonably far in the game, but not completing it. I know, but I do think the first day impressions and sales and attention is vital, and I experienced enough of the game to give you a reasonable understanding of what you'll get out of it. But before I begin this review, a few things. This key was obtained from evolve.pr for review purposes. That won't change my opinion of the game in the end, but you should know that because of FTC guidelines, as well as the whole morals thing, you know? You should also know, however, that I backed Keylocker for $250, or the plushie tier. Again, I'd like to think that given my track record, that wouldn't make a difference, but that information can be useful in determining if I'm biased or not based on the idea that a backer generally wants a game to succeed. But enough of an introduction. Let's start with the basics of Keylocker. In a world where music is outlawed, Bobo and a group of rebels fight for their freedom and their lives, while uncovering what's truly happening in this cyberpunk and dystopian world. You play as Bobo, who's captured and in prison at the start of the game, but of course, like every good rebel, has a way to break out thanks to her brother Dealer. This leads to a series of events that launches her off of prison to the world below, and running into Rocket, a unique jukebot with the ability to play and synthesize music, something that isn't just for entertainment, mind you. Music in this world seems to be tied with electricity, a vital resource that's controlled by the satellites, the equivalents of God in this scenario, and help to put those like Bobo in her place. She and her friends will have to fight back, and that is somewhat determined at the start of the game. You can choose between 4 classes at the start, all having different strengths and weaknesses. Now, I chose Sequencer for reference just because it felt like the right choice for Bobo as a character, at least the Bobo that I envision. This does have story influences, and while I wouldn't say that each of the classes are that much different in the end, keep in mind I only played through the game, well, almost played through the game once before release. Now, I could start with the game's story, but I also think the more unique draw here is going to be the gameplay, so I'm going to start there. But there are timestamps below as chapters for each section of this review if you want to skip to that section. So let's focus on the combat to start off with scripted battles where you come across an area and get attacked, and also battles you can get into while getting caught by a spotlight or running into an enemy. If you played Virgo vs. the Zodiac, there are going to be some familiar elements here, but Keylocker has its own flavor to add to the JRPG formula. Fights are done in a grid-based system, and you have 2 loadouts of 4 pieces of equipment each to equate to 4 specific actions: a life attack, a life defense, an electrical attack, and an electrical defense. Your main bars in combat are LP for life points and EP for electrical points. Veterans of the genre may immediately associate EP with MP, aka magic points, but that would be a mistake. Consider EP boosting points of a sort. They are generated mostly through doing an electrical defense, which is usually playing an instrument of some kind. The EP generated can be used to make life attacks more powerful by charging it with holding down the attack button and adding the EP to the attack. However, they can also be used for defense, which I'll get into that in a little bit. Electrical attacks will drain EP from enemies, and also add a little bit of EP to your bar as well. Each equipment has its own range and stats associated with them as well. You only start with 2 pieces of equipment at the start of the game, and each piece of equipment can be put into specific slots of attack and defense as mentioned above. Battlefields are small, but there's not usually a lot of enemies, and the compact nature of the field allows you to move around a tiny bit to get away from attacks, but still squeezed enough where pincer and boxing in tactics will be effective. Also, the turn-based element is a tiny bit misleading. It's based off your speed, and each action has a time to commit to it. Moving is usually smaller time commitments, for example, while some attacks can have big time commitments, enough to let enemies do 2 or 3 actions afterward. So understanding that and playing around with the actions to the bar above here can be very effective in battle. So you're probably thinking, okay, it's a grid-based combat where you choose the right actions at every moment, right? The game does say it's inspired by Chrono Trigger and Paper Mario with a little twist, so it's easy, right? Not so fast. Because even with some of the explanations given, there's a lot more to this combat than meets the eye. One of the big points here is the use of that electrical defense and EP to create armor points when you go into a defense. These armor points go over your health and also protect you, but also allow you to counterattack based on your equipment. Now, certain characters rely on it a lot more than others, which is the offensive and defensive classification of those classes you see at the start of the game. The counters can be devastating if used properly, doing a lot more damage and actually hitting multiple enemies than most straight attacks would, but they do have a specific range, and when a counterattack is done, you lose your armor points remaining, so if another enemy comes and attacks you, you're gonna just take damage in your life points. It should also be noted that enemies can counter too, but this is where the strength of the game lies. It leads to a fencing type dance that the game has, as activating counters when you are outside of the range of their counter is very viable and really useful. But your allies who are in that counter range, even if they're not the ones who attacked, can also get hit based off that counter. The small field pushes that idea while enforcing these situations, and really gives Keylocker an element of strategy that makes it stand out compared to other games in the genre. In addition, what this combat system borrows from Paper Mario is the timing system. When you or an enemy attacks, there will be a timing event that determines the damage done. Each weapon and enemy has different attack animations and timing, and may even be more than just a button press. It could be a very short mini game of Simon Says, for example. This time is tight, but not too tight, but leads to percentage damage on early or late hits, or even self-damage depending on the difficulty chosen. This system does incredibly well in making you invested in every fight, because a series of bad inputs, or even one bad input at the wrong time, can lead to a completely different fight and can take out characters with the snap of the fingers. No enemy is a pushover here, and one of the brilliant elements here is that there's enough variety in defenses to force you to remember timings, to the point where you could master defense in that timing, only to lose it later on because you've dealt with other enemies and other timings. Now, for your attacks, it's a little bit more, well, you know, you're going to use the weapon that you want to use, so you can get used to it, but with the variety of the attacks in terms of the electrical defense, life attacks, and the ranges, you're going to have to use your full arsenal at some point. So even then, you're going to have to deal with different timings. The combat can also be a little overbearing for newbies, specifically with some of the statuses in the later game and extra programs that can be associated with the actions involved. There's a ton of statuses here, hitting the gambit. You have simple ones like Repair, which can give back some life. You've got things that can slow down and speed up action bars like Thrive and Wither. And then you've got some really unique ones, like Dynamite, which places a bunch of dynamite around the room that will blow up after a set amount of turns. With that said, players should keep with it, as the game will keep rewarding you with more interesting battles and change-ups, like enemies going invisible, and you having to figure out where they are, or really unique battlefields and movement options that force you to think about your loadouts more carefully to handle them for the next time. It also knows what to hold back on. Healing items are limited, and means that you have to be smart going into a fight with them, especially with items being hooked to particular characters. Now, this is not a game where you can hoard resources for later use. You're going to want to use them when you need them. The game will refill them rather quickly in a lot of cases. I will say, however, that in terms of frustration, the most frustrating part about this combat is probably the situations where I don't know exactly what I did to win. This in particular happens with a couple of the boss fights, where there's some condition in which damage is allowed to be dealt, or the right key was open to do damage, but I don't know what that key was in order to do it again. In this fight, for example, I was wondering exactly why it was doing 0 damage to both characters, and then was like, well, these elephants have to be here for some reason, and at times it seemed to open up damage, but at times it didn't. And this line here, I'd get damage when I'm near it in terms of like in between the characters, but does that open it up? Boss fights in particular with dual bosses did seem to be lacking information in certain areas. In terms of bugs, I will go on record saying that there was one bug during my playthrough that crashed the game several times, in particular in long fights, and it did lead to some frustration. Granted, after working with the developer and giving them footage and some crash information, some of which I should have had to begin with, but forgot to save, the bug is gone after a release and update. At least I haven't run into it again. Now, I did play this on Steam, aka the PC, and I didn't see any performance issues. In other bugs, the only other thing that I really ran into were some visual bugs where things seemed to not actually be there, but they were drawn on screen. But the thing is, with the topic of the game, and in particular some of the cyber elements of it, I wonder if those were hallucinations, aka maybe the game was actually messing with me. Can't confirm that, but I'm not going to hold it against it. One last thing before I move on to the next section. This game is not the type of game that you want to play as a background game. What I mean by that is, a lot of people use JRPGs to play a game, but also pay attention to, let's just say, a YouTube video or, something else that they're paying attention to. With the active portion of the combat in this game, especially with some of the defensive prompts that come up, they can come up rather quickly. You don't get a lot of chances to react to it if you're not truly paying attention with some enemies. And it can sneak up on you even if you are paying attention. They're rather fast. So if you're hoping that this game is going to be one of those, oh, I'll play it, but my attention's a little bit elsewhere, no, it's not going to work for you. Let me also go a little into the non-combat side of things. For those who like quests and side content, there is a good amount of it to work with here, but it may not be on the level with certain other RPGs that you played. In terms of the overworld and quests and moving in the environment, there is a good amount of things to interact with and explore, finding new characters or little hidden Easter eggs that are hidden all about. Some of these are definitely tied to the Kickstarter and its rewards, but I did enjoy the references I saw and laughed at many of them. The quests aren't necessarily groundbreaking in terms of content. Usually you'll need to find someone or kill 1 or 2 things to handle an issue or 2. But with that said, I want to put something immediately on the table as one of my biggest issues of the game. Maybe it's my old age catching up to me, or J reviews rubbing off on me, one of the two. But I got lost on what to do next in several areas, and even to the point where I was getting majorly frustrated on how to complete certain quests or even where to start them. Like, look, I'm not expecting a map and a quest marker like in a modern FF7 remake. That's not the type of game that Keylocker is trying to be. But some of the maps and their designs, the pathways can get a little confusing on what's approachable, what you can jump on, and what's not. Like certain areas where the character can make it through, even though the model is a little bit too wide for the path being used for the angle you're seeing it at. It doesn't help that there's elements that can hurt you that you can run into, and at times you have to backtrack even though you feel like there's got to be some way through as you see a character or an item just outside your reach. It doesn't help that the game doesn't give warnings per se when you go into a scenario where you could miss content. And honestly, it would have helped to have a warning here, because that quest will just taunt you for the rest of the game. I'm sorry, Samurai Girl, I'm pretty sure this quest was involved with you, but I accidentally forced the next section of the game without realizing it. It's weird too, because some of the level designs and exploration wants you to mess with things or even find hidden items. There's plenty of times where I found a stat boost behind a building or something that isn't necessarily telegraphed, so the game wants you to explore. It just gets in its own way a lot because of that. Now, in terms of the leveling system and JRPG elements, I will say that its skill tree is unique and a bit overwhelming in certain ways. Every fight you earn keys, and those keys will be used to get you skills, but the skills here aren't necessarily typical. For example, you can put points into a program that will have an effect on every attack in that slot, sure, but you also can put points into a skill that'll get you more attack points on electrical attacks. But it also usually has a cost to them, like life or speed. So you can get really customized with the way you build characters if you really want to, or just put points wherever. But for newbies of the genre, I could see this getting extremely overwhelming, especially with the way you earn keys. It happens after every fight, and it feels like at times you should be going into the menu and spend them immediately if you're not, specifically earning for one specific skill. And it can feel a tiny bit of a chore because of that. As for the other side content, there are little mini games built into here. The first one being a rhythm game. And it's good, but also took a little bit of getting used to. If you played anything like Guitar Hero, you know what you can expect here. It uses the 4 buttons on top of the Xbox controller, and for some reason I did keep on missing certain combinations of buttons, but I think that had more to do with my hands and the pain they were in more than anything else. Granted, you do want to hit the calibration before trying these here to make sure that you're lined up correctly, and it does a good job of reminding you of some of the top rhythm games in the genre without ever hitting those highs. Well, those highs. It's a good piece of content to go with the RPG elements and thematically makes sense, however, so good inclusion. Also, the little smack the enemies with your sword game that's done when you're hacking something, I think the creator of Void Rains Upon Her Heart does this. It's solid as well. It does a good job of being a game to keep the variety going without feeling too out there, and thematically makes sense. It also reminds me that I need to get back to the Void Rains Upon Her Heart one of these days. Too many games to play, you know? Let's now move to the story, and I'm gonna be as spoiler-free here as I can, while still talking about the implication and writing. And I'm gonna be as generic as I can, while using analogies to get some detail. The first thing I'll say about Keylocker's story from the get-go is that if you're expecting an easy story to follow, or something along the lines of standard JRPG basic stories, you have another thing coming. To say that the experience of Keylocker is dense from a writing perspective would be putting it lightly. There's a lot to take in here. The hierarchy that's developed in the game in terms of roles, the relationships that tie characters to each other, how that plays into the theme of societal roles, government, rebellion, faith, courage. And that's only touching the surface. If you're the kind of person who breezes over text just to get the basics out of a story, Keylocker is not for you, even with the great gameplay involved. You're gonna have to sit here and read the text to understand it. It's also not hitting topics that are easy to handle. I mean, the main story is about standing up and defying the fate that has been dealt to you, following the path you want, and making a life worth meaning. You see it in a lot of JRPGs. But with that in mind, there are some sensitive topics here that stem from that, and I feel like it's directly related to real life in a lot of ways. For context, Munana, the developer, is based out of Brazil, and while I didn't ask the developer directly about it, there's definitely been some elements that I could see that are mirroring to the reign of Bolsonaro in Brazil and the fallout from South American countries and their governments. Now, it could be me reading way too deep into things, but that's what it felt like almost immediately in the story. I mean, it's sort of fascinating if you read up about popular music in Brazil and censorship. Okay, I'm not going to go on a tangent here, but you can go read that for yourself. While Keylocker's story goes deep into rebellion and the ills of society, you could also bet in that there's political themes like you'd see in many JRPGs, such as Final Fantasy and the Tales series. But I will say that here, it is definitely more at the forefront. Bobo isn't the passive party in this story. She's the spark and the fire starter, and it shows in her small speeches that happen throughout the story's length, and the way she ends up taking charge while causing the issues that many other characters go through during it. Which, on that note, is something I definitely appreciated. The fallout of Bobo's actions is put on display here for all to see, and what it causes to happen, and isn't overlooked just as a result of necessity or change. It was a decision she forced upon others. The game does a reasonable job of making you hate the villains while still giving them an understandable goal in most cases, even in the context of programs and more computer-based societies, which is something you will sort of have to adjust your senses to in this game. Early on, it's indicated that you're sort of programs in this world and you can be rebuilt, but it also makes it implied that death can also be permanent. It's an interesting wrinkle in the cyberpunk story here, one that I'm still unsure how I feel about, how it affects the stakes in this game, and how I should feel about characters, possibly dying. The thing you need to know about stories like Keylocker and Virgo versus the Zodiac is that there are layers to this writing, and in particular, there are things that will get recontextualized later down the road, and explain the actions of the personality quirks that characters have. It could really put into perspective why a character would be unwilling to leave a new friend, for example, and the game really rewards you for paying attention, especially in the less obvious cases. Which is funny when I think about it, because the moments that really stood out to me when coming up with the review for this game were not necessarily the big plot reveals and the interactions. They were more of the weird side stories that you get when you're just running around and talking to people, and some of the jokes that come from it. I'll spoil one of my favorites, a small box contest between a bunch of walruses. Yep, I said that right. But the thing is that this actually got me to laugh a lot and also self-reflect in a weird-ass way. And the thing is, those moments that really stood out to me in Virgo vs. the Zodiac, they are still here. It's just that they're not as common, but they do still stand out when you come across them. On a semi-unrelated note, the pacing of the game's story works for the most part, but there are sections that feel a little bit off in terms of timing, pacing, and some of the emotional toll of the story. There's a mid-section of the game where a main character completely goes off the rails in terms of their emotions and personality, and that's for a reason, mind you, and there's definitely explanations for it. It's just that the game was focusing on the buildup of this character and what they were going through, and it sort of happens way too quickly given how resistant this character was and shown to be over the game. It just sort of happens like a snap of the fingers, and it just doesn't make sense given what was going on. It felt a little bit rushed, and there were certain other parts of the game that felt a little bit rushed too. Which leads me to what people have probably been waiting on in this review, given what I've said in other videos and on Twitter about Virgo and some of the characters in Virgo versus the Zodiac, as they're some of the best written characters in the indie game space in my opinion. So you'd also hope that Keylocker would also have some of the best characters as well. And the thing is, it doesn't. But not because they are bad per se, but it's also what the game is attempting to focus on more than anything else. Look, let's take the main character, Bobo. She's a good protagonist that has depth in her character, and does well to bring a little bit of personality and edge to the rebellious leader. I mean, you would expect that, but more so a different type of edge, and still has reasonable flaws that she has to deal with. But as I mentioned, especially in the early game, she's really a voice in which some of the themes take hold of in the game, to the point where it starts to almost feel like it's a narrator voice rather than a personality. Now, she has good puns, she has weaknesses, and some good relationships to work off of. But when push came to shove in the middle of some of the emotional scenes, sometimes she can feel a little disconnected at certain points in this writing. Which, let me be clear, is purposeful, at least in my opinion. The thing is that these characters are designed to be program-like in their nature. It's referred to constantly in the plot, and thus, there is an element of restraint that would have to happen in order to pull those characters off in that retrospect without just feeling like a typical human thrown into that role. There is some restraint needed and some element where it's almost needing to be robotic, if that makes sense. The weird problem that really made me struggle with the characters is naturally I would end up comparing them to the characters in Virgo versus the Zodiac, and to a certain extent that was unfair. Rocket in this game does have similarities to Ginger from Virgo, being extremely loyal while being somewhat childish in nature, and both have great strengths and do well in pairing as a loyal partner to the protagonists. But Ginger's personality also stood out just a tiny bit more. But in that same breath, we're back to the whole program situation. Now look, I'm going to make an update video at some point on my take after playing through the game again with other choices and dig more into the characters. It could be a first impressions thing. And again, this is based on playing the game in a few days and rushing to hit a deadline to get it out at release. But I will go on record saying that I do think the highs here are great story-wise. It is very entertaining, and it also doesn't have the hit that Virgo does from an emotional level, but it's not that far off. It's got better themes that you can relate to in this game, but not as good characters, and especially not as good interconnected characters in terms of the 12 Zodiac signs in Virgo. But I could also talk about the story for hours here, and I will always answer questions in the Discord or in the comment section below. But let's move on, because I don't want this review to be an hour and a half. Finally, let's talk about the presentation a little bit. Munana games definitely have a unique style to them, despite maybe looking like another RPG on the surface. A lot of that has to do with the detail put into the character designs and personality traits you can interpret from those designs at first glance. It's one of the things that drew me to Virgo versus the Zodiac, and while I would say most of the designs on these main heroes are a little bit more toned down, that doesn't mean the game doesn't have a wide array of interesting and fun designs that makes me want to see what's next around the corner. One of the first things that I will touch on is the use of color. Not only do areas have a unique feel and energy to them thanks to the combinations of colors used, but there was always this presence of combination that got specific emotions out, even if you had no idea what the emotion was that you were supposed to feel. Whether it was the purple and green on a computer screen, or even the odd red mushroom in a sea of bluish green ones, there was ways that the game was able to capture my attention without being overzealous in terms of the use of colors. The color and shading emphasizes detail at every turn, and is able to show beauty in even the most simple of drawings and screen elements, and is well done by the design team. It also helps that the animation work in both the character and the environment is pretty dang good. Seeing a magic carpet move along is believable, and fun to watch the little sine wave that comes out of it. Don't bully me, I like my math. The small touches like the moving pixels to create that sand effect that still allows you to see everything helps really sell the environment while not getting in the way of gameplay. A lot of the little touches that you saw in Virgo versus the Zodiac are here in all areas of the game as well. Things like when a character gets angry, the text shakes and adds some real emotion to the character while still being very readable. The palette system can allow you to change the UI and the menus to how you want them to look, which goes a long way in games where you're looking at stats and text boxes a lot. As for sound design, it's pretty darn good. There are elements of the sound that stand out, ones like the clacking of a keyboard when typing, for example. Sound levels are done well, making the rain fade into the environment when needed, while making other sounds punch out to draw attention to them. The quality of those sounds overall is pretty good, and made impact on certain scenes and the overall punchiness of gameplay, especially with the counter system. Just take a listen to a few examples here, and you'll hear what I'm talking about. As for the music, this one is the weird one to me, because frankly, this game is about music, so it's definitely a lot more purposeful in what feelings and tones it's going for from moment to moment. It's literally incorporated into the plot of the game. And there are great tracks that either capture emotional highs or really get the beat going in terms of combat. But it's weird, because for me, it felt like the music faded into the background compared to the story and sound design when it wasn't the center focus. In the elements where you're doing a rhythm game, of course the music is going to make a big difference. But in the other elements, I expected it to be more impactful in certain ways. Now, it should be noted that there are vocal tracks in this game. That wasn't seen in Virgo versus the Zodiac, but the thing is, there are two versions of those vocals, English and Satarian, the language for this game. I personally found the Satarian version of a lot of the songs a little bit more impactful. It just felt more for the world, which makes sense. I mean, you make a language for the game, of course it's going to be more impactful. I want to emphasize that I feel like maybe it was just me on this one. When I listen to the music outside the game, I can get certain emotions out of each track, certain elements that I could expect that go along with the themes of the game. But for some reason, while playing in the game, I just didn't get those feelings as much. Look, I'm going to play a couple of them for you here in-game. Just take a listen and hear what I'm talking about. So, did I enjoy Keylocker in the end? I did, and I especially enjoyed the mix-up on the combat that was seen in Virgo versus the Zodiac, while adding the grid to even add more strategy to the formula, while still keeping the combat fun and difficult, while not driving me up the wall in frustration. The story does a good job of setting up big reveals and plot points, while still making you care about the characters for the most part, despite not hitting the level that Virgo vs. the Zodiac did. There's some good replayability from what I see, and I still was smiling and laughing while loving the music and the presentation. But when push comes to shove, I would put Keylocker under Virgo when it comes to my overall enjoyment. It's the little things here that add up. The quests and the characters can get a little confusing at times, and I felt like I was lost a good bit. And the tiny things, those little details, like some of the humor that I saw in Virgo, it's here, but it doesn't necessarily hit as well or as often, even if the story was going for something more serious in the long run. Is it worth buying and playing? Absolutely. It gets a 93 out of 100, making it a must-buy even if you're hurting for cash. And maybe after a few more playthroughs, it will earn its place on the Indie Wall of Fame. But right now, it's just in the elite games outside of it, which again, is nothing to be disappointed about. Play the game, it's fantastic. Now, that doesn't take into account my enhancer system, which takes the more subjective element of games and tries to match a game to you. If you fall strongly into one of the following categories on screen, add or subtract that score to the main score. If the first digit of your score changes, refer to this chart to see where the game lies in the buyability rating for you. Now, as you can see, there are some scenarios where maybe you don't want to pick up the game or pick it up on sale. Again, this game is going for a specific audience and definitely has elements that could turn off certain players, especially with the complexity of not only the story, but of the gameplay. But I think you should give it a try nevertheless in the end. It's still got those elements, especially for people who may be on the outside looking in terms of certain JRPG elements. I think it does enough different that it may be intriguing to you. Thank you if you made it this far into the review. If you like this content, hit that like button and the subscribe button for more content like this. Is this review exactly what I wanted it to be? No, I wanted to complete the game, obviously, but sometimes things just run amok in terms of bugs, in terms of things that just get in the way in terms of real life. And the fact of the matter is, those first few days are very important for an indie game, especially with the limited time you may have on Steam in terms of visibility. So I did want to get my opinion out there. I will be playing through Keylocker at some point in terms of on stream for a second run. Of course, we'll be completing the game, but regardless, keep an eye out on Twitch to see when I do that. Anyway, coming up next, no idea. This was the big one. I just did 2 reviews within a week pretty much. So yeah, I'm tired. I've got a lot of work to do, and there's a whole wedding that I need to really focus on right now. So just join the Discord if you want updates for what's going to happen with the channel and so on and so forth. Anyway, that's it for now. And as always, keep on gaming.